Hello and welcome to Atheists Talk. My name is James Zimmerman. I'll be your host for this show. This is actually the second of a two-part show that we're doing today on diet and atheism, which might not seem as obvious at first glance, so that's why we're exploring it in this two-part show. Our host, or our guest, is Rohit Ravindran. Welcome again.
Thank you for having me.
The first part of our show, we had a bigger biography exploring your past and what brought you here today. So watch part one if you want to learn more about Rohit. But I'll just say real quick, you're a recent engineering graduate and that you blog for the Humanists of Minnesota, where you cover topics from ethics, humanism, science, politics, things of interest to humanists. You're also one of the contributors to the recently published book, Atheist Voices of Minnesota. And in that book, you wrote an essay. You submitted an essay for the book, I should say, in which you talked about your views on ethics as they pertain to atheism, obviously, because that's what the book is for, and animal rights, too. Yeah. So in the first part, besides learning more about you, we also talked about the inherent violence to animals regarding creating them or using them as food, and then we also defined some of the terms such as veganism and vegetarianism. So watch part one if you want to be brought up to speed on that. But what we want to do now is see how it ties more in with a bigger worldview, especially atheism, because this is Atheist Talk. So maybe I'll just ask you, like, how does you did mention a little bit, like, in your own life and exploring through philosophy, but how does being an atheist lead logically to being a vegetarian or a vegan?
Sure, James. I think that's a really good question that I get asked quite a bit in the atheist community when atheists realize that I'm a vegan. So as atheists, we obviously don't think that there is a God or that God created us in his own image. That's primarily a religious belief that God created human beings and then gave human beings dominion over all other animals. But as atheists, we reject that. As atheists, we accept the Darwinian model of evolution. We recognize that human beings have evolved for millions of years through the naturalistic process of evolution, of propagating our genes, and we have done so alongside other animals. We have done so in conjunction with other species. So at this point in our in our human history, in our progression of evolution, we really have to ask ourselves, what is so special about human beings that makes us think that it's okay to subjugate and to torture and to kill other animals? And I think that's where atheism really ties into veganism, because from a purely objective viewpoint, from a viewpoint from the universe, for example, you would not think that there is something intrinsically special about human beings. I mean, we obviously are capable of feeling pain, of feeling suffering, and we know that other animals are scientifically capable of feeling pain and feeling suffering as well. And so really drawing that arbitrary line, saying that human beings are very special and we can just neglect the interests and the needs of all other species, is primarily tied to a religious view that that God created human beings and that gives us all the rights and the power of dominion. So that's where I think it's really connected.
So you mentioned, maybe you can reiterate this from the first part, you talked about how they went hand in hand with you. It's not like you were an atheist and then 20 years later you became a vegan.
Right, exactly. Again, applying principles of philosophy, so applying principles of logic and rationality and consistency, we can see that non-human animals can feel pain, they can feel suffering. And if we want to be consistent, we need to ask, why are we applying one model of ethics to human beings and a completely separate model of ethics to animals when we share similar interests, those interests being avoidance of pain, avoidance of suffering, and seeking out our species-specific behavior. So really, if as atheists we embrace rationality and logic, I think that inevitably leads us to see other species as not as means to an end. Yeah.
So when it comes to religion, I think even religious people would agree with me that some people just are religious because that's how they were raised and they've never really thought about it. I think that even someone who's very conservative in their religion would agree that there's people who just don't think about it, they just do it. Yeah. But there are people who have thought about it and still continue to do it. So I think we can say the same thing about eating meat too. Some people, that's just, the culture, it's just what they've always done. It's never dawned on them.
Right.
That's why they eat meat.
Right.
They never thought about not doing it. But then some people have maybe heard some of the arguments, and they still do. Like one might be, one argument is maybe the most popular, is that humans have evolved to eat animals. Clearly we see animals eating other animals. Sometimes we might even see some that we would consider lower forms eating higher forms. A lion might eat, a chimpanzee, for example.
Right,
and that's just what they do. So
Yeah.
we're also animals, as you said. So
Yeah.
how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting argument. The problem with that argument really is that it falls prey to a logical fallacy, the logical fallacy being the naturalistic fallacy. So naturalistic fallacy is essentially the belief that just because something exists in nature makes it okay or justified. And that is completely not true or rational, which is why it's a fallacy. So when we think about the way we have evolved in the past, we might have evolved to eat animals. That might be true. We have also evolved to have, for example, sexual urges, indiscriminate sexual urges. There's so many things that come with evolution, but we don't just accept all of them in modern society. We pass them through an ethical, moral lens in order to create a society that does maximize happiness and minimize pain. And so I think this argument that just because something has happened in the past makes it okay to do so is really flawed.
Yeah.
There's a famous quote saying that you can't really get an ought from an is. So just because something is a certain way doesn't say anything about the moral justifications for it. We have kept slaves for hundreds of years. We have subjugated women for hundreds of years, but we don't think that that is okay in today's society because we have come to the realization that that all human beings can share similar experiences. And I think we need to reach the same point when it comes to animal ethics, and unfortunately we haven't. But the animal rights movement is trying every day. Yeah.
I think that's a great argument about passing everything through this filter of logic and asking why we do it, instead of just applying a blanket statement that because it exists. I was at a family gathering once, and one relative said something along the lines of, if we were supposed to control our reproductive organs, through birth control, then God would have, given us birth control. Which on the way home, my wife and I just laughed at that because,
Right.
we were also born naked.
Right.
But
right.
for almost all of our day, we go through with clothes,
Yeah.
even when laying in bed usually. So
Right,
we
right.
pass things through filters, and we realize, oh yeah, there's good reasons for using birth control at times and for wearing clothes at times, and the reasons vary. So, you have to pass everything, even something as silly as maybe wearing clothes, through these filters and think about them.
Right.
But the thing about evolving to having eaten meat in our evolutionary past is maybe it's needed for our diet.
It might have been needed for human evolution in the past, but today scientific evidence clearly shows that eating a vegetarian or a vegan diet is not only equally healthy, but it's actually healthier than a diet that consists of meat. For example, I have a couple of quotes here. There's one from the American Dietetic Association and the Dietitians of Canada that says that a vegetarian, including a vegan diet, can meet current recommendations for all nutrients. Well-planned vegan and other types of vegetarian diets are appropriate for all stages of life cycle, including pregnancy, lactation, infancy, childhood, adolescence. And in fact, vegetarians have been reported to have lower body mass indices than non-vegetarians. They have lower rates of death from heart disease, cholesterol, lower blood pressure, lower rates of hypertension. So I don't think that the health argument really holds any water today.
How about this argument, moral reciprocity? Or to break that down, animals, they're not really moral agents, so they shouldn't be part of our moral discussion?
Yeah, that's an interesting one as well. And it was actually popularized by famous philosopher Immanuel Kant.
Oh, okay.
So what Kant essentially said is that animals, they're not rational and intelligent, and because they're not rational and intelligent, they don't know how to differentiate between right or wrong, and because they don't know that, they can't really be part of the moral community, and so it makes and that makes it okay for us to use them in any way possible. It's kind of equating moral duties to moral rights, saying that if you don't understand that you have a moral duty, how can you claim a moral right? And it's an appealing argument until you dig a little deeper, and until you actually look at how we construct ethics in human society. So I would say that there are two groups of human beings that you can look at. One are children. I have a 4-year-old nephew whose only sense of morality is essentially breaking everything around him. He has no sense of what is right and what is wrong. Do we think it's okay to kill children or to torture children just because they don't have a sense of moral duty? Of course not. We stand up for the rights of children, in this country, around the world. And the second group of people you can look at are the mentally disabled, the mentally handicapped, those people who have such severe psychiatric illnesses that they don't understand ethics or morality. Yeah. Do we think it's okay to break into a psychiatric institution and harvest organs from these people or kill them for our pleasure? No, we don't. We think that's extremely immoral. And the basis for that is that we accept that children and the mentally disabled can feel pain and suffering. So it doesn't matter if they have an understanding of moral duty. What matters is that they can feel pain and suffering, and so we're not going to cause any unnecessary pain and suffering to them. Yeah. And again, to be consistent as atheists, we need to apply that same principle when it comes to other sentient beings like non-human animals.
Okay, well said. So what about this argument? It's really hard. I mean, you mentioned Paul McCartney in part 1. So he's a billionaire, so he can say, I'm only going to eat this food, My house is going to run on only wind energy, and I'm going to buy these windmills, or I'm, only going to travel in this kind of car that's good for the environment. But it's tougher if, you're not receiving royalties from Sgt. Pepper's every day. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can see how it is really hard. I think it's much harder for people in other parts of the world who don't have real choices. But I think for people who are living in America today, who are making a decent wage and who live close to co-ops or supermarkets, you have plenty of vegetarian, vegan options. You go to any restaurant today, well, most restaurants, and they will accommodate vegetarians and vegans.
That's even a change, I would say, since the 80s. I don't recall seeing, I mean, of course, then I was so young, I maybe am just speaking from fogginess, but I don't recall seeing stuff like that on menus. But now you're right, there's usually a vegetarian burger or there's other options.
Right, and I mean, that's what I've heard from a lot of people, that back in the day, there didn't used to be a lot of those options, but today it's becoming more and more easier to do so. And so I think if you really embrace the ethical argument and see how unjust it is for billions of animals today to be tortured and killed, if you really accept that, then it's absolutely essential that one has to make the effort then to transition over to a vegetarian or vegan diet.
Okay. We were going to talk about some of the other aspects too, or other benefits besides just not causing undue pain to animals, and one would be the environment.
Yeah. I mean, the environmental aspects are so strong. I've got a couple of notes here. I mean, all these organizations like the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Center for Science and Public Interest, the Pew Commission, the World Watch Institute, they all agree that a global shift towards a vegan diet is vital to save the world from the worst impacts of climate change. And when we're talking about climate change, animal agriculture makes a 40% greater contribution to global warming than all of transportation put together. So you could be riding your bike to work every day, but if you are eating a diet that contains a substantial amount of meat or dairy in it, you are still causing very harmful effects on the environment. And when it comes to animal farming, I should say there are two main global greenhouse gases that we're talking about. The first one is methane. Animal agriculture is responsible for 37% of methane that's produced by human activity. And methane offers 23 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide.
Oh, wow.
And the second is nitrous oxide. Animal agriculture produces 65% of nitrous oxide which provides a staggering 296 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. But these things are overlooked even by advocates of environmental advocates who see veganism or vegetarianism as an extreme step. They forget about this huge industry that is harming the environment every day and focus on factories and transportation. And I think we need to come to a realization that it is all these sources that are harming the environment.
And then also, well, we touched on this a little bit, but maybe you had something else to add. But the health of the person, not the animal.
Right.
But how is that benefited by being vegan?
There was an interesting study called, by the Harvard School of Public Health. It was actually published in the Archives of Internal Medicine. The study included more than 121,000 men and women for an average of 24 years. So it was a huge sample size, and they got a lot of good data. And the study clearly showed that diets that contained red meat increased the risk of dying prematurely by 13%. Processed red meat, like hot dogs, sausage, bacon, upped the risk by 20%. So it's completely not the case that veganism is worse for your health. It's the opposite. Veganism and vegetarianism can be extremely good for your health. But as always, you need to follow a balanced diet. So I know some people who have tried a vegan diet and have felt like it wasn't nutritious enough and switched back to an omnivorous diet. But they simply do not take the time and the effort to really plan out their diet in such a way, because changing diets is obviously a big step to take. And so there needs to be a lot of research and a lot of information that is processed before you do so.
I saw a poster online, if you call it a poster when it's online. It was got the point across in a kind of crass way that it's, it said the argument that being a vegetarian is unhealthy, and then below it it showed a morbidly obese man on a scooter, unable to walk. He's so morbidly obese, and then next to him there was a very attractive man, like well sculpted, oiled, like beautiful Atlas kind of guy, right? And then underneath it said, guess which one is the vegetarian? And there's no doubt as to which one's been packing the the Big Macs.
Right, exactly.
So that was kind of a crass way to make it, but it was saying, look at this man who's I don't know if he was a bodybuilder or just a model or something, but obviously he's healthy,
Right.
And he must be a vegetarian, otherwise the argument wouldn't have worked. But
right, definitely. And maybe at this point I should mention one of the books that I've been exposed to recently. It's called the China Study, and it was two researchers who conducted this study in, I believe it was 65 counties in China. And they correlated these studies with dietary surveys and blood work from about 6,500 people, 100 from each county, and examined the relationship between the consumption of animal products and a variety of chronic illnesses such as breast cancer, prostate cancer, diabetes, heart disease. And again, they reached the same conclusion. Of people who were eating diets that had more animal products had a greater incidence of these diseases, and people who were following a vegan diet or a diet that's close to veganism had higher mortality rates or lower. I mean, they lived longer essentially. So the evidence is just out there. People just had to go out and read it.
Yeah. When you talk about the health aspect, that kind of answers the one other objection that I was going to ask you about, is that people will say, what's wrong with, say, hunting or fishing, or let's just say I own my own chickens that free run in their backyard and I take their eggs. So we don't have the environmental impact because these are pretty much wild, not the chickens in my backyard, but let's say if I hunt deer, if I go fishing, these are animals that are existing making methane anyway. And right up until that last minute, they had a life in the wild. Temple Grandin once said that nature is cruel, but we don't have to be. So maybe they were in nature, so they maybe would have had a really cruel, terrible death. But if we just shoot them and do away with them right away, then right up until the last minute things were good. So is there an objection to that?
Yeah, I mean, I still don't really agree that it's okay to somehow kill animals if they haven't lived a life of pain. Because you still have to ask the question, why is it necessary to kill that animal? And you still have to weigh out the costs and benefits to yourself as a human being and to the animal. And so when you're talking about hunting, are you talking about hunting for food or for pleasure? Or,
well, I guess, here in Minnesota, the majority of people that I come into contact with who are hunters, it's a pleasurable experience. It's not a necessity to feed their family because they can't afford to go to the grocery store.
Yeah. And in that case, clearly, hunting for pleasure doesn't justify killing an animal that has an active interest in living his or her life. Animals, they have an experiential existence. So, they experience pleasures of going foraging for food and the social connections that come with their tightly knit groups. There's just a lot of profound experiences that animals can have that don't really justify sort of the superficial pleasure that we get from shooting a gun at them. So I think that's a very clear case of immorality, I would say. But even when it comes to hunting for food, if one has a choice to go to the supermarket and buy vegetables and fruits and follow a vegan diet, the same question arises. Why is it necessary then to go out and take this animal's life that the animal clearly cares about? Whether we care about it or not, the animal does. So it's a more subtle point for sure. I think factory farming does have way more deleterious effects than activities like this, but I still think that it is wrong to do so. Yeah.
I think I might be grew up in the minority then because my family all grew up in New York, very urban area, and then they moved to Minnesota, south of the Twin Cities, right before I was born. So my whole childhood, I remember my parents being completely baffled that people took pleasure in hunting and that it was such a big, they just thought, what's the fun of killing the animal? None of us were vegetarians. So, while sitting there eating our Whoppers, we were wondering, what's the fun of killing an animal? We just thought, it's just what you got to do to eat, but why? So maybe I'm coming at that from an outsider, but in Minnesota, it's clearly perceived as it's even in the Minnesota Constitution that it's part of our natural or our state heritage. So.
Right. I think that's very sad. And, as animal rights groups get more influence in this city and in the state, hopefully they'll be able to make a difference.
So my last question is, how can we learn more? You mentioned a book in the previous section, and then of course there's videos, and then you already mentioned one book, but we had a couple others. Do you want to talk about those in the remaining 5 minutes here?
Yeah, sure. So one of the first books that I read while I was contemplating going vegetarian in college was Animal Liberation by Peter Singer. Peter Singer is probably one of the most famous philosophers who's alive today, and he's an atheist, a humanist as well. He's devoted his life to two main causes. One is animal liberation and educating people about the ethical issues, and the second is actually altruism towards people in different countries rather than within your own country. But when it comes to his book Animal Liberation, he talks in detail about the ethical issues that comes with killing animals and causing pain and suffering to animals. And he has this interesting combination of the philosophical reasoning and the scientific reasoning as well that he brings to the table. Since he's an atheist, he's very grounded in rationality, in science, and in logic. And he's often been criticized for that because his logical arguments take him to some uncomfortable places when it comes to human beings. But I think that is sort of the logical result of thinking on a rational basis. Yep.
Okay, so that one is Animal Liberation, and then what else?
There's the most recent book that I read was Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer. He was before he wrote this book, he was really a conscientious omnivore, and so he kind of had issues with eating animals, but he would still do so. Because of peer pressure, tradition, getting together with family.
Sure.
But then him and his wife, they had a child, and once he had this child, he suddenly realized that I'm going to be responsible for feeding my child, and that prompted him to think more about the issue of meat and where meat comes from, and so his book it's really beautiful. He kind of articulates the points in a very poetic way. Since he's primarily a
A
fiction.
novelist,
Yeah,
right?
a novelist, exactly. So he brings that to the table. It's it's a very emotionally appealing book, but at the same time, it's one of the strongest investigative books that I have
Okay,
read.
so he's not just coming at it from a poetic, emotional.
No, not at
Okay.
all, and that's the beauty of it. He combines that with all the hard facts and statistics.
Okay.
In fact, as part of writing the book, he wasn't able to get access to factory farms for a reason that I talked about earlier. Factory farms, they don't let anyone come in who might report negatively about it. And so what he had to do was actually contact an animal activist and break into a slaughterhouse, in the middle of the night, dressed up in black overalls and clothes and a mask, and he talks about that experience as well.
And then we got just a little bit over a minute left, but let's talk about some more active things people can do besides just reading a book. There are groups in the Twin Cities. You want to mention some of those quickly?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say the two major groups in the Twin Cities are the Animal Rights Coalition, and the second group is called Compassionate Action for Animals. They do a great job at educating people about veganism and vegetarianism.
Okay.
So they do a lot of community outreach programs, but more importantly, they do a lot of social events as well.
Okay.
So as a vegan or a vegetarian, you can often feel ostracized in a community like this in America, and so they provide sort of that social support. Animal Rights Coalition actually has a mentor program where they can pair you up with a mentor.
Sure.
They call it Vegan University. They have a couple of components to it. But the mentor program, you get a mentor and you talk about your struggles in transitioning over to veganism and kind of work it out with them, get advice, go out to co-op together, that kind of thing. Yeah.
All right. And they have internet presence, I hope?
Yes, they do.
Because a lot of people are watching this online, so then.
Yeah. They so they have meetup groups, each one of those, and they have Facebook groups as well. And you can always Google for either group and find their website.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, thanks again, Rohit, for being on the show.
Thank you, James. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. And thank you for listening to our show. If you'd like to contact us on the information you see on screen, please do so. We'll be happy to send you a copy of our newsletter so you can find out more about us. Because if you're interested in us, we're interested in you. Thank you so much for listening.